Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to Phil 385 585 Reason and Choice, lecture week 9. So we're starting today on the fourth and final topic of the course, the prisoner's dilemma. But it follows on directly from topic 3, game theory. We're not leaving game theory behind. The prisoner's dilemma is a particular contribution of game theory, and we'll be looking at it from the standpoint of game theory. But it's a famous puzzle or paradox in its own right. You may well have heard of it, and it's able to be expressed and understood quite intuitively and non-technically, informally, that is, without using the theoretical apparatus of game theory. And it's the sort of simplicity of it that is sort of the most perplexing and maddening thing about it in some ways. Very easy to state, very easy to understand, and yet very hard to see how to solve it. So the last 3 lectures of the course will be on this topic 4, the prisoner's dilemma. Okay, so here's the setup, and I'll express it fairly informally to begin with. So 2 people have, let's say, committed a crime together, a robbery, let's say. On suspicion of having jointly committed the crime, they've been detained and put into separate cells in the prison, so they're unable to communicate, and then they are separately interrogated. Now, the situation is this, and it's important to understand that this is common knowledge for both detainees. Firstly, if one of them confesses while the other does not, confesses the crime, and the other one keeps silent, he who has confessed will be immediately set free for helping the investigator, while the other will be put away for 10 years. If both confess, both will be put away for 9 years. If both keep silent, both will be put away for 1 year on a lesser charge, a misdemeanor. Let's suppose there's not enough evidence to support the more serious suspicion unless they confess. Okay, so in other words, the setup is if both of them confess, then they serve 9 years in prison each. If one confesses and the other remains silent, the one who confesses will be set free. The one who remains silent, 10 years in prison. If both remain silent, both of them will serve only 1 year in prison. Okay, so let's just look at this from the point of view of one of the agents. So we'll call the agents A and B. So here are the possible outcomes for A, ranked in order of best to worst, in terms of the outcome. Can be understood in game theoretic terms, in terms of and rational choice theory, in terms of utility, rankings, and so on. Okay, so clearly the best outcome is if A defects and B cooperates. Now, I need to sort of explain the defect and cooperate terminology here. It's a bit unfortunate in some ways, because it can be confusing. By defect, we mean defecting on the other detainee, on your accomplice, defecting against them. And by cooperate, you mean cooperate with your opponent, right? With your fellow detainee, your accomplice, the other prisoner. So by defect, we mean here confess. You defect against your accomplice and you confess to the police. And by cooperate, we mean keep silent to the police and you're cooperating with your accomplice. It's a bit unfortunate because cooperate makes it sound like you're cooperating with the police, right? You're a cooperator, you're telling the truth. Ratting on your comrade and so on. But in practice, we have to use defect and cooperate because This is the terminology that has become standard in talking about the prisoner's dilemma. Okay, so as long as we understand what we're talking about, we'll be fine. So clearly the best option for A is A defects, confesses, and B stays silent, because then A will be set free. The second best option is if both A and B cooperate with each other and stay silent, because then they just get the 1 year. They both get just 1 year on the lesser charge. That's the second best outcome for A. The third best outcome for A is both A and B defect. That is, they both confess the crime, and then because then they both get 9 years. The worst for A is obviously the inverse of the best. A cooperates, A stays silent, and B defects. B confesses, because then A gets 10 years. Okay, so that's clearly the ranking of best to worst outcome for A. Okay. Now, putting it in game theoretic terms, which we've got this in the topic notes. In the topic notes, our two prisoners are given names, Anne and Peter, and we have a simple payoff matrix here in game theoretic terms, the different possible strategies and their payoffs. C, there's cooperate, and D is defect. So this is the information I just gave you, but set out in a clearer matrix form. So you can see there, the top left box is the option of both cooperating. Be careful with the words we use, not confessing, cooperate. So they both stay silent. -1, they both get 1 year in prison. The bottom right square there, -9 and -9, is they both defect. That is, they both confess. They both get 9 years in prison. And then the bottom left and the top right represent situations where Anne defects and Peter cooperates, or vice versa. So if Anne defects and Peter cooperates, we have the bottom left there. Anne set free, 10 years in prison for Peter. Top right, the reverse. Anne cooperates, Peter defects, 10 years in prison for Anne. Peter set free. Okay. And we've encountered similar matrices in terms of strategies and their possible outcomes in game theory before. Okay. Now I'll give an informal characterization of why this is a dilemma. It's fairly straightforward. So let's suppose A reasons this way. Okay. What's the rational thing to do here? What ought I to do? And as elsewhere in game theory, the answer will depend on what you expect B to do. Okay, so what can B do? Well, B can cooperate, or B can defect. So we need to think, okay, if I'm A, what's the rational thing to do in each of those situations? Given the outcomes associated with different combinations of strategies. Okay, so let's suppose that B defects on A. B confesses. Well, in that case, what should I do? Well, in that case, I better defect, because if B defects and I cooperate, that's the worst outcome for me, right? If Peter defects and Anne cooperates, then that's the worst situation for Anne. She gets 10 years in prison. So if Peter defects, you better not defect, you better cooperate, right? So if Peter defects, it's clearly best for Anne to defect. B defects, it's best for A to defect, rather than cooperate. Suppose B cooperates. Well, if B cooperates, what's rational for me to do? Well, again, it's best for me to defect, because if B cooperates and A also cooperates, they both get a year in prison. But if B cooperates and A defects, A gets set free. Getting set free is better than spending a year in prison. So if B cooperates, it's best for A to defect. So whatever B does, whether B cooperates or B defects, it's best to defect, because in each case, I'll get the best outcome by defecting. So if I'm rational, I'd better defect. Whatever B does, that's the rational thing for A to do. But of course, the situation is entirely symmetrical, and B is reasoning exactly the same way. If A defects, it's best for B to defect. If A cooperates, it's best for B to defect. So it's rational, whatever A does, for B to defect. So both end up defecting, and this is, the outcome of an entirely rational process. Each are, exhibiting absolutely unimpeachable rationality. But now, of course, both defect, and so both end up getting 9 years in prison, whereas if they cooperated, they would have only got 1 year in prison. So clearly the best thing for them would have been to cooperate. The best thing for them collectively would have been for them to cooperate, right? -1, -1. But they both defected through this rational process of reasoning. They both figured out that the best thing to do is to defect, but they've got a much worse outcome by both defecting, 9 years in prison, than if they'd both cooperated. Somehow each acting rationally and pursuing their own individual interests rationally has led to a worse outcome than if they'd acted irrationally. Okay, it seems like it would be better to be irrational. And it's important to see, again, this results from each agent acting rationally, looking out for their own interests. Whatever the opponent does, it's best to defect. This doesn't result from a failure of rationality, and yet something's gone wrong because they've got 9 years in prison when if they'd only cooperated, they would have got 1. So it seems that individual rationality can lead to bad collective outcomes, and that's highly counterintuitive. Rappaport puts it this way: 2 irrational individuals will do better than 2 rational ones, right? A and B have acted rationally, they've ended up with 9 years in prison. If they'd been acting irrationally and they'd cooperated, and cooperation, you might think, well, cooperation is clearly the rational thing to do because they end up with 1 year in prison rather than 9. So C for each of them is the rational thing. And so choosing D is irrational, choosing C, give you a better outcome, is rational, so the rational choice is C. But as we said, you can't get around this process of reasoning. You say it's rational for both to cooperate. Well, okay, but if Peter cooperates, what's it rational for Anne to do? To cooperate? No, to defect. Clearly, if Peter cooperates, the thing to do is to defect because you get off scot-free. So it can't be rational for Anne to cooperate if Peter cooperates. And same for Peter. It can't be rational. The rational thing to do is to defect. And yet, that leads to a worse outcome than if they'd cooperated. So this is not a failure of rationality. Okay, this results from 2 agents acting rationally. And that's where the puzzle, the paradox, lies. 2 irrational individuals, it's irrational to choose C, right? Because whatever you're up to cooperate, it's irrational. So whatever your opponent does, the rational thing to do is to defect. So if they both act irrationally and choose C, they end up collectively better off than if they'd been rational. Okay, so we express the paradox informally, and can be understood informally, but you'll see, and we actually discussed this in the last lecture, when we looked at a particular instance of the prisoner's dilemma, people standing up at sporting events. Because I'll talk in a minute about how it's not a puzzle about people who've been detained in prison. That's one example of the general form of the puzzle, or the general setup, can apply to a whole range of different situations, and not just in the social world, but in the natural world as well, among non-human plants and animals. So this general form of this paradox, which has different instances. So we discussed it a bit last time about how this is clearly a situation where game theory is going to allow us to analyse it, because this is an interaction between 2 agents where what's rational for one agent to do depends on what the other one is going to do. The rational strategy of one agent depends on the strategy pursued by the other agent, and that's precisely what game theory is about. Okay, so game theory was kind of made for the prisoner's dilemma, and much of the work in game theory has been focused on this particular game, this particular form of interaction. Obviously, there are many other types of games that game theory can apply its tools to, but this is one that has been discussed in great detail. Okay, so expressing it kind of more formally, expressing game theoretic terms, DD, that is the strategy where both agents defect, is that's the only strategy pair that constitutes an equilibrium point. So recall, this comes from John Nash, an equilibrium point is a combination of strategies such that each strategy is the best response to the other strategy, that there isn't a better response. Okay, so a game has an equilibrium point if there's a combination of strategies where each is the best response to that strategy, and that's a kind of stable point. And not every game has an equilibrium point. We saw earlier in the course that rock, paper, scissors doesn't have an equilibrium point because there's no combination of strategies such that each is the best response to that strategy. Whatever combination you get, rock, 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 paper, rock, scissors, whatever, one of those strategies can be bettered by another strategy. Right? Rock, rock is not a stable strategy because for each agent, each player, there's a better strategy than rock against rock, i.e. paper. No equilibrium point in that game. But there is one in the prisoner's dilemma, and it's DD. It's an equilibrium point because defect is the best response to defect. So neither can do this. It's not like rock, rock. You've got rock, rock in rock, paper, scissors. There's a better answer to rock than rock, i.e. paper. But as we've seen, there's no better answer to D than D. C is a worse answer to D than D. Okay, so DD is an equilibrium point. And game theory predicts that if there's an equilibrium point in a game, that those are the strategies that rational agents will choose. Right, so the game theoretic prediction for a prisoner's dilemma situation should be that as long as both participants meet the appropriate idealizing assumptions, each will choose D. And that's a prediction of game theory, which accords with the informal intuitive analysis of the situation. Okay. So clearly, if the agents can cooperate, there's some way to get them to cooperate, that'll be a way out of the trap because they'll both get 1 rather than 9 years. So how can they do that? Well, the kind of natural first answer that people give when confronted with the prisoner's dilemma is, look, the issue is that they're not able to communicate. They're in separate cells. That's where the problem lies. If only they could get together and hammer out a plan, make a commitment to each other, even a promise to cooperate, then they can keep that promise, they can cooperate and get a better outcome than if they both defect. But the problem is that this isn't going to solve the problem either. Before I get onto that, okay, hang on, just a moment. Sorry about that. So before I get on to talking about why making an agreement isn't going to solve the problem, note that in order for A to choose to cooperate, A must have 2 kinds of reasons. A must have reason to think that B will cooperate, right? Because of course, in the absence of that, A ought to expect B to defect, given that that's the rational thing to do. Whatever A does, A should expect B to defect, other things being equal. And if A expects B to defect, then A ought to defect. So she has to have reason to think that B won't do what game theory and intuitive analysis predicts that B will do, or that B will cooperate. But that's not enough. Just having reason to think that B will cooperate is not enough, because if B cooperates, the rational thing to do is to defect. So just having that reason to think that B will cooperate doesn't yet give A a reason to cooperate. Gives A a reason to defect, if anything. Okay. A must also have a reason to cooperate given that B cooperates. Because seemingly the rational thing to do is to defect if B cooperates. A must have some reason to cooperate given that B cooperates. And that's what's required to get them to both cooperate. Okay, so that was, I just wanted to go through that as sort of a preliminary to getting into this issue about if only they could communicate and reach an agreement to choose C. Will that solve the problem? Well, even if the agreement is a promise, it seems that that won't solve the problem. Because A could reason in this way, and A is seemingly rationally entitled to reason in this way. Yes, we have an agreement that each will choose C. Okay, we've made that agreement. Well, let's suppose the agreement entitles us to an expectation that the other will choose C. Now, we may not, actually be justified in that expectation. As we've seen, well, as will become clear, even given the promise, it's probably, it's reasonable to expect the other person will defect. But anyway, that's getting ahead of ourselves a bit. Let's suppose the agreement entitles to an expectation that the other will choose C. Well, then Peter is entitled to expect that I will choose C. But if I choose C, then it's rational for Peter to choose D, to defect. The choice will yield him the greatest possible payoff, namely 0 years in prison. So even if there's an expectation that we're going to choose C, and so Peter expects me to choose C, I should expect him to choose D, because the rational thing for him to do when I choose C is to choose D. That'll yield him the greatest possible payoff. Now, yeah, we've promised each other to choose C, but, what's a promise worth? I mean, the agreement is not binding. I can break the promise if I want. And so Peter would have two conflicting reasons. One is the agreement as a reason to choose C. The other is the incentive to maximise utility as a reason to choose D. How can I be certain of which one will prevail in Peter? I can't be certain that he'd choose the promise over maximising utility, and in the absence of such a certainty, it's rational for me to choose D, which I will do. So that was perhaps a bit involved, but it's fairly easy to understand. The issue, is that even if we promise each other to choose C, this doesn't change the fact that it's still rational to choose D. Okay, it's still rational to break the promise if that will be in my interests. If I'm a utility maximizer. What reason do I have to expect that the other person will choose to honour a promise rather than maximise her expected utility? Okay. And what reason do I have to expect that they will expect me to honour the promise? I expect the other person to be just as suspicious about me going against my interests as I am about them. So we get this kind of, endless iteration of could I expect him to expect me to expect her and so on. But it basically comes down to this question of why should we honour a promise rather than maximise expected utility. And if my accomplice decides that I can't be trusted to honour the promise, then they would choose D, of course, because he expects me to choose D. So why should they honour it if I'm not going to honour it? But if I think that they think that I can't be trusted, then I should choose D. So it's not just a question of why should I think that the other person will honour the promise. It's also why should I think that they would expect me to honour the promise. Okay, so we get this almost infinite kind of iteration of each ought to choose to defect on the expectation that the other will choose to defect, on the expectation that the other will choose to defect, and so on. Whichever way you slice it, the thing to do is to defect. So prima facie, even promising each other to do C will not enable us to escape from the PD trap. Okay. Perhaps there isn't honour among thieves after all. Okay, so I'm just going to talk now about what are called repeated or iterated prisoner's dilemmas. We'll be talking about one-off games. Right, there's just the one-off choice: do you defect, do you cooperate? But in repeated or iterated prisoner's dilemmas, there's a series of games. You can choose to defect or cooperate, and then on the next turn you can choose to defect or cooperate, and then the next turn, and so on and so forth. And this allows for responses to the way the opponent has previously played. If your opponent has previously defected, then you can punish them by defecting on the next one. You can forgive them by cooperating, and so on. So you can get different strategies for how to approach an iterated prisoner's dilemma, which changes the situation quite drastically. And we'll see that it's in iterated prisoner's dilemma that there might lie some hope for getting out of the PD trap. The reason being that while there's no way to escape the conclusion in a single one-off game that the rational thing to do is to defect, that's not necessarily the case in an open-ended series of exchanges. That is, just generalizing from the single case and saying it's always rational to defect, that won't be the optimal strategy in an open-ended series of exchanges. Because if you keep defecting, then the other player is obviously going to cotton on and not cooperate at all. So the other player is going to defect, start defecting on every round as well. And this will entail a stable string of defections, which will clearly not be to either player's advantage. Okay. And so we have different possibilities of different strategies here. There are simple strategies: always defect, always cooperate, or flip a coin to decide whether you're going to defect or cooperate. But there are more complex combinations of moves that can constitute strategy. Cooperate when your opponent has just cooperated, defect when they've just defected, defect when they've just cooperated, otherwise cooperate. You can imagine any number of strategies, approaches to the repeated prisoner's dilemma. There's a particular strategy called tit for tat, which is very simple. In tit for tat, you cooperate on the first move, then you do whatever your opponent did on the last move, i.e. reward cooperation with cooperation, punish defection with defection. They cooperate, you cooperate, they defect. On the next move, you defect. Tit for tat, although it's a very simple strategy, has actually been shown to be a stable, workable strategy that both players can benefit from. Obviously, it depends on what your opponent is, what strategy your opponent is doing, so is pursuing. So this is the complication of game theory. It's not just this strategy. Strategy X is the best strategy, full stop. It might depend on what strategy your opponent is pursuing. Strategy X might be the best strategy given your opponent is pursuing strategy X, but it might be a poor strategy given that they're pursuing strategy Y. Right, so the strategy that's rational will depend on the strategy your opponent's pursuing. That makes things complicated. But tit for tat has been shown to be a stable, workable strategy against all sorts of different strategies, and if both agents are pursuing the strategy of tit for tat, it's been shown, will end up overall with better outcomes than any other strategy that people have devised. And all sorts of different strategies have been devised. So ever since prisoner's dilemma, the idea of iterated prisoner's dilemma has been discussed. There have been these sort of tests getting people to try out different strategies. Well, firstly, there have just been not trying out strategies, but just getting students, economic students, to sit down in a room and engage in an open-ended or a finite series of prisoners dilemma games and just see what people tend to do, what strategies people tend to adopt. But then there have been tournaments which have been set up specifically to test particular strategies. People have submitted different strategies, and indeed this has been put through computers. So computer algorithms embodying certain strategies have been tested against one another. This has been done in great detail. The political scientist Axelrod has been one of the main people involved in this, with different strategies being devised and tested, and tit for tat just has turned out to be the best strategy overall. When put up against a whole range of different strategies, it will give you the best outcome. Okay. But this depends on the iterated prisoner's dilemma being open-ended, being understood to be continuing indefinitely without end. Although, of course, in practice, there's always going to be an end point at some stage. But if there's a fixed number of exchanges, if you say, okay, we're going to have 10 or 50 or 1,000 rounds of this game, and then there'll be it's understood to be a final round, it actually turns out that it's still optimal to defect every time. Why? Well, you may as well defect on the last turn, because your opponent won't have a chance to punish you. The last turn effectively becomes a one-off prisoner's dilemma game, because there's nothing happening after it. And so the rational thing to do on that occasion is to defect. Because if your opponent cooperates, it's rational to defect. If they defect, it's rational to defect. So you ought to defect, they ought to defect. So you'll both defect on the last turn if you're rational, and each will understand that each will defect on the last turn. Okay. So now consider the second last turn. Well, the last turn, you know that you're both going to defect. And whatever happens in the second last turn, on the last turn you're both going to defect. And so you may as well defect on the second last turn as well, because again there'll be no chance for you to be punished if you defect, because it's already established that you're both going to defect on the last turn. Okay, so you may as well defect on the second last turn as well, because the rational thing to do, whatever your opponent does, you ought to defect. And by knowing what's going to happen on the final turn, you lose that open-ended sense of, well, it's not always rational to defect, because if I defect in future rounds, I might be punished for it, and if I cooperate, I might benefit from that. And so all that disappears when there's no question of you both not defecting on the final round. So in the second last round, it again becomes essentially a one-off game prisoner's dilemma, and both agents should defect if they're rational. But you can see where this is going. If they're both going to defect on the second last round no matter what, they both may as well defect on the third last round no matter what, and so on, all the way back to the beginning, no matter how many turns that is, if it's 5 or 100 or 1,000. If you are rational and think it through logically and rationally, the thing to do is to defect on every round. So this is again a form of the prisoner's dilemma trap with a fixed finite number of exchanges. Now in practice, this is not what happens. I said that tests have been done. Researchers have got students to sit down and engage in these iterated prisoner's dilemmas and see how they choose to play the game, what strategies they pursue. And suppose there's a game of 100 rounds, in practice they don't do what I just said is rational to do by defecting in every round. In a game of 100 rounds, it seems, the empirical evidence shows, that people only start defecting regularly towards the end. It's towards the end when this realization, this kind of logic of the situation I just described, kicks in. They both realize that they better start defecting, and you get a stable string of defections towards the end. And interestingly, economics students begin defecting earlier. So they have a clearer insight into the situation. But presumably that's an example of irrationality. If they were to do it, if they're involved in a game of 5 rounds, it's much more likely they defect in every round because they can understand the logic of the situation of why it's rational to defect in every round. That's not as clear the longer the game goes, the more rounds there are. But that's just a failure of rationality. That shows that the people involved in the game don't satisfy our idealizing rational assumptions. It doesn't show that what they're doing is rational. Okay. Okay. So that's the basic setup of the prisoner's dilemma and why it's a paradox, and that's I've talked about the difference between one-off games and iterated prisoner's dilemmas. In the next couple of lectures, I'll be talking about possible solutions to the prisoner's dilemma. Is there any way out of the prisoner's dilemma? Well, I guess I mentioned it briefly. I intimated that the hope might lie in iterated prisoner's dilemmas. But anyway, I'll talk in more detail about possible solutions in the next couple of lectures. But I want to just give a few other examples of prisoner's dilemma. Because I said that prisoner's dilemma type situations that have this particular structure, occur in all sorts of different contexts. So the last lecture I mentioned standing up at sporting events. We can see that has the same structure. Suppose you have two options, to stand up or to sit. And the rational thing to do depends on what other people in the crowd are doing. And to simplify it, let's suppose that they're either all standing up or all sitting down. Well, there are 4 possible outcomes that we can rank in this way. The best outcome for you is you stand up and they all stay seated. That's the equivalent of you defect, they cooperate. That's the best outcome, you get the best view. The second best view, or the second best for you, best outcome, is if everybody stays sitting down, you stay sitting down, they all stay sitting down. That's the equivalent of you all cooperate. Because then, you get a moderately good view, but you don't have the effort of standing up. The third best outcome for you is if you are standing and they're all standing. That's the equivalent of everyone defecting. You get just as good a view as in the second situation, where everyone's sitting down, because everyone's at the same level, so you get the same view as if everyone's sitting down. But now you're standing up, which takes more effort than sitting down, so it's a bit worse than the second best outcome. And then the fourth and worst outcome for you is if you stay seated and everyone else stands up, the equivalent of you cooperating and them defecting, because you clearly then can't see a thing. Okay, so 4 outcomes. Again, different combinations of defecting and cooperating, ranked in that sort of way. And as we saw last time, you reason in this way: if everyone else stands up, the rational thing for me to do is to stand up, otherwise I won't be able to see. If everyone stays sitting down, the rational thing for me to do is to stand up, because then I get the best view. So whatever everyone else is doing, the rational thing for me to do is to stand up. But then everyone reasons in the same way. Everyone stands up, and so everyone then is worse off than if they'd been able somehow to reach an agreement to all stay sitting down. Okay, the rational thing to do is to defect, stand up, whatever anyone else is doing, but the outcome then is everyone's worse off than if everyone had stayed seated. Okay, it's basically what I said last time, but just expressing it in a way that makes it clear how it's an example of exactly the same sort of setup as the prisoner's dilemma. A much discussed example is arms races. Think of the massive nuclear build-up, nuclear arms race between superpowers of the US and the USSR during the Cold War. You might think, well, each side is spending millions and millions and millions of dollars on stockpiling these huge numbers of nuclear weapons, and they're still at kind of parity in terms of their military competitive advantage. If only somehow they could make an agreement to disarm, then they'd be at parity. They'd both still be in the same competitive situation with respect to the other as they are with the massive stockpile of weapons, spending all that money, and then they'd save millions and millions of dollars. But, of course, you've got a prisoner's dilemma situation again. If your opponent is arming to the teeth, then you'd better arm to the teeth to stay competitive with them. The worst situation is if they arm to the teeth and you don't spend any money on building up weapons, you'll be at a competitive disadvantage, and that would be a catastrophe. That would be the worst situation. The best situation is if you are arming and they're not, because then you're at a competitive advantage. So if they don't arm, if they don't build up their weapons, then it's a rational thing for you to do is build up your weapons. So whatever they do, either arming or not arming, the rational thing for you to do is to arm. That is to defect, equivalent of defecting. And so, again, the situation is that both reason in this way, both are rational, and both end up stockpiling huge amounts of money on weapons, and are both therefore worse off than if they could somehow reach an agreement to not spend any money on weapons, and they'd be at the same level in terms of the competitive situation between them. Okay, so again, exactly the same structure as the prisoner's dilemma. Okay, these are real examples, and of course that's a much more serious example than just standing up at sporting events, but it has been analysed in terms of it being an example of the instance of the prisoner's dilemma. Advertising spending, this can be expressed in a sort of slightly amusing way. It's been said that when cigarette advertising on television was banned, that was actually very much in the interests of the tobacco companies. Why? You might think that's against their interest, and no doubt they fought tooth and nail against that prohibition. The prohibiting of the advertising, TV advertising. The reason it's in their interest is because is the same as the reason it's in the interests of the US and the USSR to agree not to spend any money on arms. Because when all the big tobacco companies are all spending the same amount, and they were spending millions and millions to gain a competitive advantage, but they were all spending the same amount, they all had the same market share, and none were at a major competitive advantage. And then if they were all spending nothing, then they're at the same sort of level of competitive advantage. They all had the same kind of market share and everything else. Because as long as they're all kind of spending, the big companies spending roughly the same, then if they all spend nothing, then they're at the same level in terms of competitive advantage, market share and so on. But now they're saving millions and millions of dollars on advertising that they can use elsewhere. So it was actually in their collective interests not to have to spend the money anymore. Now, this is a bit different because if you're talking about forcing them to not spend money on television advertising, then that's there's no choice there. They didn't choose to overcome the prisoner's dilemma trap by agreeing with one another not to advertise on television. In fact, they precisely had not agreed to that, and were continuing to spend huge amounts, and so they wouldn't have been able to get out of the prisoner's dilemma trap themselves unless they had been. The only way they could get out of the trap was to be forced out of it by being forced to stop spending money. All of them stopped spending money on advertising. Okay, how are we going? Let me just check time. Okay. Good. Doping in sport, a similar example. If we assume that, so think of a sport like cycling where doping has been rampant, where it's understood that all or virtually all of the top cyclists were doping in a similar sort of way, and so just as previous examples were at the same competitive advantage as if nobody had been doping, if they could just all get together and agree to not to all of them to not dope, then would all be collectively better off than all of them doping in the same sort of way. Be better for their health, be better for the integrity of the sport, be better for their individual chances of not being caught and thrown out of the sport and whatever, and they'd all be the same competitive advantage. But of course, you have prisoner's dilemma. If no one else is doping and you dope, then you'll be at a competitive advantage. If everyone else is doping, then you better do it, because otherwise you'll be left behind. Everyone reasons the same way. Everyone dopes, and everyone's collectively worse off than if they'd agreed among themselves somehow to not dope. Okay, and no doubt these examples could be extended indefinitely. Okay, so in other words, prisoner's dilemma type situations arise all sorts of areas in society, in social life, same kind of puzzle, same kind of paradox, same kind of individual rationality leading to worse outcomes than if people had acted irrationally, it seems. Okay. This is very widespread. It's also seemingly widespread in the natural world. And I'm going to talk a bit about, for the remainder of this lecture, talk a bit about prisoners' dilemmas in biology. I don't want to spend too long on it because this is a course about reason and choice in human affairs, in social life. It's not a course in biology or the philosophy of biology. But I think it can help us to understand the nature of the prisoner's dilemma by talking about how it's not just a feature of human rationality and human conscious choice. It's the structure of it exists even when there isn't such choice, even when there isn't such conscious deliberation and reasoning on the part of rational agents. Okay, we'll see that plants can be understood as engaged in prisoner's dilemma type situations and tragedies. And I think understanding that can, and so seeing that this is a puzzle, a paradox that has a structure that's abstract enough that it doesn't just apply to human conscious decision making, but to can apply even when there isn't such decision making. I think that can deepen our understanding of the prisoner's dilemma. So that's sort of my excuse for talking about prisoner's dilemmas in biology. Also, I think it's just intrinsically very interesting. Okay, so first, game theory in evolutionary biology. Evolutionary biology has been a fruitful area of application for game theory. Game theory was developed in the 40s by von Neumann, Morgenstern, these people, to apply to economics in particular. But it wasn't long before evolutionary biologists began to realise that the tools of game theory could be applied to understanding evolutionary phenomena. Because evolutionary biologists are interested in the study of interactions among organisms where certain strategies are pursued. And the best strategy for an organism in a particular situation, that is the strategy that contributes most to the organism's fitness or adaptedness, the extent to which they're adapted to their environment, depends on the strategies that other organisms are pursuing. So the mathematics can be the same essentially as in the social situation. The rationality involved is the rationality of natural selection, in a way that I'll explain in a minute, rather than the rationality of the individual agents involved in the situation. Human agents, according to rational choice theory, are utility maximizers. Organisms, according to evolutionary theory, are fitness maximizers. Okay? So fitness takes the place of utility. It's what is what's understood be the thing that's being aimed at by the agents, either consciously or unconsciously, typically unconsciously in the natural world. So we talk about organisms pursuing different strategies. It's not consciously aiming to achieve the best outcome for them, but certain strategies will contribute to fitness better than other strategies. Right? Certain strategies pursued by organisms will increase their chances will maximise their chances of surviving and reproducing better than other strategies. So some strategies contribute better to fitness than others. Just as in the human social case, some strategies will lead to better outcomes in terms of utility than others. Okay, so you see that structurally it's the same sort of thing, and why game theory ought to apply quite well to biological case as well as the human case. Okay, John Maynard Smith, the British evolutionary theorist, has been one of the key figures in applying game theory to evolution. I recommend his book, Did Darwin Get It Right? Essays on Games, Sex and Evolution, which is a series of mostly popular, not entirely, but mostly popular articles, many of which deal with the relationship between game theory and evolution. Maynard Smith developed the idea of an evolutionarily stable strategy. An evolutionarily stable strategy, understood in game theoretic terms, is a strategy that, when common in a population, is fitter than any alternative strategy. A strategy that, when common, can't be invaded by a mutant strategy. So if there's a population of organisms pursuing a certain strategy, if some other strategy should arise within that population, the common strategy will be fitter than the mutant strategy, the new strategy. So, in other words, the strategy can't be invaded by a mutant strategy, which is fitter and therefore will proliferate and drive out the original strategy. That can't be done. So you've got an evolutionarily stable strategy when you have a strategy that is able to resist invasion by and being swamped by a mutant strategy, because it will always be better. It will always defeat any new strategy that comes along to challenge it. And when you've got that, you've got an evolutionarily stable strategy, a strategy that does well in competition with other copies of itself. Okay, and that brings up the notion of frequency-dependent selection, which is important in game theoretic analyses of evolutionary theory. Frequency-dependent selection asks about the fitness of a particular phenotypic trait in context where, well, asks about the fitness of it when there's a population and okay, so I'm not explaining this very well. So we want to know how fit a particular phenotypic trait is in context where there are other examples of that trait, and in context where there aren't many examples of that trait. So certain traits will do well in a population with lots of other examples of that trait, and some will do badly in that situation. Some will do well when it's in a population when it's quite rare. When a particular phenotypic trait is quite rare, it will do well, and others will do badly when it's rare. So positive frequency-dependent selection is where the more common a trait is, the fitter it is. It does better the more copies of itself it's in competition with. Negative frequency-dependent selection is where a trait is fitter when it's rare. The smaller the number of examples of that trait within a population, the fitter the trait is. Okay, so that's what we mean by frequency-dependent selection. Obviously, that's relevant here. An evolutionarily stable strategy is a strategy that exhibits positive frequency-dependent selection. When it's common, it does well. It does well in a population with lots of other examples of itself. Okay, but I don't have time to go into that in more detail now. So that's game theory in general applied to evolutionary biology, and in particular the prisoner's dilemma has been applied to biology. The prisoner's dilemma has been used to model the evolution of altruism and cooperation by natural selection. Okay, just hold on a sec. Okay, sorry, so so the prisoner's dilemma has been particularly applied to biology to model the evolution of altruism. Evolutionary theory predicts that organisms ought to be selfish, ought to always pursue their own selfish interests. Of course, selfish organisms will be fitter than altruists. Those who look after the interests of others over their own interests are clearly going to do worse in the struggle for survival than organisms that are looking out for their own interests. They'll pass on less. Altruists will pass on less of their genes. It's not clear how altruism can evolve in a Darwinian world. Yet altruism of various sorts does exist in the natural world. Organisms do sacrifice their own interests for the interests of other members of their species or their group or whatever. There are a number of different ways of explaining, accounting for altruism, biological altruism in an evolutionary context, including group selection and kin selection and reciprocal altruism. But it's also been explained in terms of strategies for dealing with iterated prisoners' dilemmas. So, how do prisoners' dilemmas arise in the natural world? I'll give a couple of examples and show how it has the same structure as what we've looked at. So, consider trees in the forest. Why do trees in the forest grow so tall? Well, what trees are aiming to do above all is to get access to sunlight, to get the most access to sunlight, and they're competing with one another to get access to the sunlight, and so trees grow tall in order to outcompete the other trees in getting their fair share of sunlight. Sunlight here is that's the good that they're competing for. But if all the trees are essentially growing to the same height, then they're a bit like the superpowers spending all their money on weaponry, but being still being essentially a parody, or the cigarette companies spending the same huge amounts of money on cigarette advertising. If the trees could just somehow get together and agree to stay small, to grow to just half the size or a quarter of the size, then they'd all be better off collectively because they'd all be at the same competitive situation, have the same market share of the sunlight, as it were, as if they'd grown as tall as they had, as if they'd grown very tall. But they don't, because you've got a prisoner's dilemma situation. If the other trees are growing tall, it's rational for you to grow tall. If all the other trees are not growing tall, it's rational for you to grow tall. So whatever the other trees are doing, if they're growing tall or growing short, the thing to do is to grow tall. All the trees are subject to that reasoning, as it were, and so they all grow tall, and so they all end up in a situation worse than if they'd somehow been able to agree to, or if if natural selection had instilled in them the ability to not grow tall, instilled into them the trait of only growing short, and they all had that trait. Another example that Dawkins talks about is birds that engage in a kind of reciprocal altruism. So there are birds that pick ticks off each other's backs. And it's a kind of reciprocal altruism because if bird A picks ticks off the back of bird B, bird A can expect bird B to return the favour later on. So everyone benefits. And so it's all very nice. They're helping each other. everyone benefits collectively. But if you think about it, what this represents is a kind of solution to a prisoner's dilemma. Because it might seem irrational for an individual bird to pick ticks off the other bird's backs. Essentially, they're all cooperating here. But imagine a bird who defects. Well, if you think about it, it's rational for an individual bird. The thing to do for an individual bird that will most maximise its fitness is to defect and not pick ticks off the backs of the other birds. Why? Well, suppose everyone else is cooperating. Everyone else is being altruistic and picking ticks off the backs of other birds, including yours. Well, if you are inclined not to return the favour, then you get the benefit of them picking the ticks off you without paying the cost. It's a cost, it takes time. It's something to pick the ticks off the back of other birds. It's so you could be spending your time better. It's a cost. It is a cost. And if you could not pay that cost but get the benefits of others paying the cost, then that's the best situation for you. What if you're in a population of defectors? What if the other birds are reasoning in a similar way, as it were, and not picking ticks off anyone's back? Well, you'd better not be altruistic in that context, because that would be a disaster, because you're not getting any benefit from anyone else, and you're just paying the cost without getting any benefit. So whether you're in a population where others are altruistic or others are selfish, it seems like the individually rational thing for you to do is to be selfish and to not pick ticks off others' backs. That kind of selfish behaviour we would expect to evolve by natural selection. In fact, you don't get that. In these populations we're talking about, you do get this altruistic behaviour, which is not a prediction of Darwinian theory, at least simplistically understood. In other words, in some way or other, these birds have found a solution to the prisoner's dilemma, have found a way out of the trap of the prisoner's dilemma, which itself requires explanation, because the trees are growing tall, they are stuck in the prisoner's dilemma, in the trap. The birds, insofar as they're helping each other, have found a way out of the prisoner's dilemma. That's what we mean by the fact of the prisoner's dilemma and ways of responding to it. In particular, iterated prisoner's dilemmas, right? So the birds, it's not just a one-off decision. Do I, in this particular case, get the grubs and ticks and things off the insects and things off the back of this bird? It's not just a one-off case. It's an iterated. There'll be many other opportunities to decide whether or not to. And lots of different interactions, lots of interactions with the same birds over time in the population. Iterated prisoner's dilemmas. How do you deal with them? That's been a way of understanding the evolution of altruism in the evolutionary context. Now, I've been talking about what's rational for the trees to do, or how the birds reason, but of course that's metaphorical. There's no reasoning going on with the trees. There's no conscious decision made by the trees, or probably with the birds, frankly. But we can talk of natural selection choosing certain strategies, and all we mean, and that's still metaphorical, as natural selection isn't an agent which selects in a conscious way certain things. But all we mean here is that certain strategies will be encoded in the genes, and the genes will contain instructions for certain strategies that will arise spontaneously. And then certain strategies will enhance fitness in certain environments, and others won't. And those that enhance fitness sufficiently in certain environments will evolve, just like any other adaptive traits will evolve by individual selection. Okay, there's no conscious decision made, but just as neither the individual mammal nor natural selection consciously decides to construct the mammalian eye or the nervous system or whatever. No one at any point makes a conscious decision to construct these phenotypic traits, but they evolve gradually through the course of evolutionary history on the ground, on the basis that they are adaptive, contribute to fitness, and so enable their bearers to outcompete their competitors in the struggle for life. and therefore are selected, and they evolve, and so on. It's a completely blind process, no conscious decision making or conscious selection going on, but we know how these phenotypic traits evolve in the Darwinian sense. It's just the same way certain strategies encoded in genes, insofar as they confer fitness on their bearers, will evolve just like any other traits. Okay? So, consider the trees. Well, in an environment where other trees are small, what's the fittest strategy? What strategy, when encoded in the genes of the tree, will lead to the tree being the fittest in that environment? Well, clearly, growing tall, the strategy that that makes the trees behave as if they're following this strategy of growing tall. That's the fittest strategy. Well, in an environment where other trees are growing tall, what's the fittest strategy? The fittest strategy, again, is to grow tall. That is, trees that are such that the strategy grow tall is encoded in their genes, those trees in an environment where other trees are tall will be the fittest. Okay, so in all of the relevant environments, the fittest strategy is grow tall. Trees whose genes tell them, as it were, instruct them, cause them to grow tall, will be the fittest. Okay, so that's why we can understand prisoners' dilemma situations even when there isn't conscious choice. Even when you're just talking about trees and plants, you're talking about a situation where the prisoner's dilemma kind of reasoning applies. Okay. So arguably the only way this can be overcome, and perhaps this is what's happened in the case of the birds, the only way the evolutionary prisoner's dilemma trap can be avoided is through something like group selection. Sure, in any particular environment we're talking about, individual defectors are fitter than individual cooperators. Okay. As we said, the individual bird who defects, you might wonder about the morality of being selfish when the other birds are being altruistic and refusing to do your bit and pick the insects off the other birds when the other birds are doing their bit. But of course, that kind of moral thinking with respect to plants and animals, non-human animals, is completely inappropriate. There's no morality in the animal world. They're not, there's no altruistic motivations. Everything ultimately has to be understood in terms of adaptation and what's in the interests of either genes or organisms or groups or species or whatever. Okay, so we saw that in a context in which other birds are being altruistic and picking the ticks off, the fittest strategy is to be a defector and not pick off the ticks. Okay. Whether we think of that as morally admirable is irrelevant. Okay. So an individual defector is the fittest in that situation. But a group of cooperators is fitter as a collective than a group of defectors. A group of small trees, other things being equal, is collectively fitter than a group of tall trees. Right? A group of birds where they're all altruistic and picking the ticks off each other is fitter than a group of selfish birds, none of which are helping the others clean their ticks off, collectively. Okay, so if you've got two groups, one of which is full of altruists, the other which is full of selfish individuals, non-altruists, the altruistic group will do better as a group, will be fitter as a group. And that's true for any situation where there are altruists and non-altruists. And this is really the same point as the point that the two prisoners who cooperate are better off collectively, better off as a group, than the two prisoners who defect. Okay. In either the situation where your accomplice is defecting or cooperating, the rational thing for you as an individual to do is to defect. Okay, so defecting is the optimal strategy. But it's still the case that if you both defect, you're collectively worse off than if you both cooperated. That's really the point here about better off collectively. And in Darwinian thinking, Darwinian theory, we can understand group selection as being the process where you have different groups that differ in the extent to which their members are altruistic or selfish, and more altruistic groups will do better as groups in the struggle for survival, which takes place among groups as well as among individuals. You can have a whole bunch of groups, and they're all competing as groups with one another. I mean, think of human hunter-gatherer tribes, which are competing against other hunter-gatherer tribes as collectives for resources and land and food and so on. Groups of altruists, insofar as they help each other, are clearly going to do better than groups of non-altruists. As groups, they're going to do better as groups, and therefore they are more likely to reproduce as groups, to give rise to more groups. So this is just Darwinian natural selection applied to the level of groups. When there's variation in groups, when some groups are fitter than others as groups, more adapted than others as groups, better able to survive and reproduce as groups than others. You get that competition, struggle for life, and a kind of heritability of groups. Groups tend to give rise to other groups like themselves. Then you have all the elements of natural selection, but at the group level, not at the individual level. And so group selection then has been understood to be one possible mechanism, and even Darwin understood this, whereby altruism can evolve, seemingly against the predictions of Darwinian theory, which would be that you would not expect to see altruism. Okay, so perhaps that's a way to get out of the prisoner's dilemma trap for non-human animals when confronted with prisoner's dilemma situations, group selection. The process is very vulnerable to subversion from within, for precisely the reasons that we've seen, that a selfish mutant, an individual selfish defector which comes along, I suppose there's some mutant gene that in a population of altruists, the gene causes its bearer to act in a selfish way, causes the individual bird in a population of birds that help each other to just look after its own interests. As we've seen, that selfish mutant will have high relative fitness because they'll get all the benefits from the altruism of its fellows without having to pay the costs, and so it will have the highest relative fitness, pass on more of its genes, and in the context of that group will outcompete, on average, the altruistic competitors, and that selfishness will then proliferate throughout the group. The group will go from being an altruistic group to being a selfish group quite quickly. It's called subversion from within, subject to the altruism, then subject to being swamped. The collectively beneficial altruistic trait then can be swamped by the individually beneficial selfish trait. And that's just really another way of expressing the point that defecting is always the rational thing to do. Defecting is always, especially in a context of altruists, when everyone else is cooperating, the best thing to do is to defect. It's a rational thing, what confers the highest fitness. And even though collectively it might be best for everyone to cooperate, individually the thing to do is to defect. And that's again sort of the tragedy. So hopefully there you can see connections between the prisoner's dilemma situation and the situation that confronts organisms interacting with one another in an evolutionary sense. Okay, now we're going for time. Okay, I think that's enough for today. Thanks very much. So I've introduced the prisoner's dilemma, talked about it a bit in general terms. I've given you a few examples of prisoner's dilemma type situations in social life and some examples of prisoner's dilemmas in the natural world and in biology. Next time I'll probably begin by talking a bit about the problem of collective action in social theory and social science, which is closely related to the prisoner's dilemma, and then I'll talk about some possible solutions to the prisoner's dilemma. So, thanks.